Good evening. Thank you all for coming out this evening and for braving the very difficult California winter. I'm told that the next nor'easter to strike Boston, which is Professor Green's hometown, the second in a week, is going to bring at least 6 to 8 inches. Sorry to be sending that back to you back to that tomorrow. It's a great honor to introduce Arthur Green as the David S. Lobel Visiting Scholar of Jewish Studies. The rector of Hebrew College Rabbinical School, Professor Green has held faculty positions at Penn and at Brandeis University. His scholarship of Jewish mysticism across 4 decades has placed him at the very forefront of his field. His books, including well-known classics like The Tormented Master and Keter, and his many articles have consistently pushed the study of Kabbalah and Hasidism in new directions. But Green has also spent much of his career training rabbis, as dean and later president of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical School, and then as the founder of Hebrew College Rabbinical School in Boston. His scholarship of undergraduate, graduate, and rabbinical students combines the best of intellectual history with a keen attention to phenomenology and religious experience. And on a personal note, I think I can share that it's one of my greatest honors to introduce my own teacher to give this lecture this evening. I would like to thank the David S. Lobel Visiting Scholar in Jewish Studies Fund, the Toby Center for Jewish Studies, and the Department of Religious Studies for making this evening possible, and of course to Linda and Nicole for their amazing work, as always. Professor Green's lecture this evening, Taming the Shamanic Impulse, the Emergence of the Hasidic Master, will explore the charismatic leadership at the heart of Hasidism, a movement of renewal and revival that shaped the course of Jewish modernity. Please join me in welcoming Professor Green.
Good evening, good evening. Nice to see you all. Thanks very much, Ariel. It's a pleasure to be here. I spoke at this department, maybe 15 years ago once, and have a long-standing sense of connection with this department, both through my friendship with Arnie Eisen over the years and the fact that Van Harvey of this department was my department chair at Penn many years ago. So I feel connected to what goes on here, and it's a pleasure to be here, and indeed a pleasure to get away from the winter. Thank you very much for this invitation. Hasidism emerged on the screen of history in the years following 1772, bearing the banner of Israel Baal Shem Tov, who had died a dozen years earlier. Frequent quotations of his teaching and glowing tales about him make it clear that he was the master behind Hasidism. He was the one around whom the image of the Hasidic leader, the Hasidic tzaddik, was to be fashioned. As the movement grew and diversified over the course of the following half-century, however, it might be argued that with such very diverse spiritual phenomena as Chabad or Braslav or Komarna or Kutsk, which are Hasidisms very different from one another, what they had in common was their shared reverence for the memory of the Baal Shem Tov and the very diverse claims to speak in his name. Each one tried to make the Baal Shem Tov say what they thought the message of Hasidism was. In saying so, however, we have to ask which aspect of the Besht or Baal Shem Tov's legacy we're talking about. Because Israel ben Eliezer, the Baal Shem Tov, was a unique character, and you might say that there were 3 different aspects of his personality or of his calling. First, he was a Baal Shem. A Baal Shem, literally it means a master of the name. He was a folk healer who used the power of both divine names and herbal medicines to effect cures. That was his profession, you might say. As such, he stands within a line well known of figures in the 16th to 18th century among Ashkenazic Jewry in Eastern Central Europe, but actually a tradition reaching much, much farther back into Jewish history. Healing by means of magical names was something that went on already in the Talmudic era. We have incantation bowls, magical incantation bowls in Aramaic that probably go back to the 5th or 6th century and maybe even before. By the 18th century, Baal Shem, master of the name, is really a professional designation. People went to consult him and to help them in times of need, mainly on medical matters, but sometimes on other things as well. The Baal Shem Tov, in addition to being a Baal Shem, was also a Kabbalist. A Kabbalist, we usually translate it as Jewish mystic, but a Kabbalist meant a person who studied the various intricate details of meditation on prayer, kavanot, or directions for prayer, a person who could effect tikkunim, or repairs of the cosmic order, by his concentration on certain mystical formulae. The tikkunim he was supposed to bring about also had this worldly implications. Sometimes he would defeat the enemies of a particular person or the enemies of Israel. There's an overlap between these two categories, but they're not exactly the same. There were Kabbalists who had nothing to do with being Baalei Shem, that is to say, Kabbalists who were not available as healers. And there were Baalei Shem, or healers, who knew only enough to affect their magic, to bring about their magical healing, but hadn't really studied the depths of Kabbalah. So these are two areas he combines, but then there's a third one, which is most important. The Best was a unique spiritual teacher, offering personal counsel to people on how to attain dveikut, or attachment to God in prayer, how to deal with distracting thoughts. He became particularly famous, most famous, for his rejection of asceticism. He would advise people that mysticism and self-flagellation or punishment of the body did not have to go together. He urged people to stop worrying too much about their sins, to serve God always with joy. That's really probably what made him first made him famous. He became known as an uplifter of spirits as well as a redeemer of souls. This role as spiritual counselor is not necessarily associated either with a Baal Shem or with a Kabbalist. That was something different. All of these areas, of course, come together. He was a unique personality and he was a charismatic, and so you can't separate these from one another in him, nor can they really be separated in his successors within the Hasidic movement. I don't mean to imply otherwise. But the founders and early leaders of Hasidism were mainly interested in this third aspect, were mainly given over to preaching and exemplifying a kind of spiritual renewal in Judaism. That's what they were about. It was the ecstatic prayer life of the Best and his somewhat world-embracing spiritual enthusiasm that most inspired the disciples of Dov Ber of Mezrich, who really created the movement and brought the movement into historic notice. But just as these functions were united in him, so they were not separable in his successors. The degree to which a Hasidic Rebbe involved himself in matters of healing varied considerably. There were figures, including the Best's own grandson, Baruch of Mejbesh, or such a popular Rebbe as Aryeh Leib of Shpola. He was known as the Shpoler Zayda, the old man or the grandfather of Shpola, for whom aspects of the one-time Baal Shem's calling were absolutely central to defining their role as Rebbes. People looked to them primarily for healing, as well as for blessings that would bring about good fortune, or even curses. You could go to them to have them curse your enemies. That would work too. Others, including members of the Mezrich circle, like Shlomo of Karlin or Nahum of Chernobyl, engaged in healing, both natural and supernatural healing, but those were sidelines to their life as preachers and spiritual guides. That's what they were primarily there for, as we'll see in a moment. A figure like Shneir Zalman of Ladi, the founder of Chabad, who utterly disdained that sort of activity, was unusual among the early Hasidic masters. You could not ask Shneir Zalman to pray for you for worldly matters. He considered that somehow beneath him and a distraction from his real spiritual calling. But that was quite unusual. Most of them combined these things. Beginning with the Maggid, that is to say, the successor of the Baal Shem Tov, the charismatic teachings and persona of the Baal Shem Tov come to be described by the term tzaddik. Tzaddik, literally righteous one. This term too has a long prior history in Judaism, distinct from and only rarely overlapping with Baal Shem. As I said in an article I wrote a long time ago, that tzaddik, in contrast to the Baal Shem Tov, is a creature of normative Jewish society. There are two uses of the term tzaddik in old Jewish sources. One of them comes out of a forensic context. The world is divided between tzaddikim and rishaim. That literally means the innocent and the guilty. You are found at tzaddik if you're let off in court. You are at tzaddik, you're not guilty, you're innocent. So the world is more or less half and half. But then there's another usage of the term tzaddik, where the tzaddik is an unusual figure. He's a kind of spiritual Hercules, somebody who holds the world on his shoulders. The whole world depends on a single tzaddik, and the tzaddik saves the world. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai once says, already in the Talmud, that there's only one tzaddik in the world, and he is it, self-proclaimed tzaddik. But the figure of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, as he's recreated in the Zohar in the 13th century, becomes a very important impulse to the growth of the sense of tzaddik, because tzaddik there also has to do with a certain aspect of the divine self. God is the tzaddik, and the human tzaddik is imitating God, but the tzaddik aspect of God and the tzaddik aspect of the hero is a kind of symbol of fecundity, a symbol of male a power which is spiritual and sexual at the same time. He is the one who brings about the union of God and the Shekhinah, both from above and below. And so the tzaddik becomes a very important symbolic figure, really the central figure of Jewish piety in some ways for the Kabbalist. In the intense atmosphere of post-Sapphic pietism, that is to say after the 16th century, augmented on both sides of the Sabbatian outburst, Shabtai Tzvi is the mystical messiah who was proclaimed in the 17th century, and both before Shabtai Tzvi, leading up to this messianic outburst, but also after Shabtai Tzvi in the intense period of penitential piety after people realized that he wasn't the Messiah. On both sides of it, the idealization of the tzaddik figure grew even stronger. Whether epitomized by Rabbi Shimon, by Isaac Luria, or for some by Shabtai Tzvi himself, the elevation of this figure takes on a very central role. In order to understand more about the relationship between these two figures, the Baal Shem on the one hand and the tzaddik on the other, it's necessary to examine a little bit more of what the Baal Shem actually did in the pre-Hasidic context. Remember that our contemporary distinction between medical problems and moral problems, or between heavenly enemies and earthly enemies, was not quite so clear to people in the 17th and 18th centuries, in this early, just edge of modernity universe. One's ill fate, if you indeed had an ill fate, must have been decreed from above. And why did that come about? Why do you have an ill fate? Probably because of sin, but maybe also because of a spell cast by somebody else. Or maybe just the whim of an evil spirit. And that evil spirit might have power over you because of something you did in a prior incarnation. And a residue of sin was left over, and therefore that evil spirit could fasten onto you, could gain hold of you. These evil spirits were very, very much filled the imagination of Jews in the 17th and 18th centuries. It was a very full universe. If you read, for example, some of the stories of Isaac Bashevis Singer, you can see that the demonic possession that was so much a part of the East European Jewish imagination was still alive in the early 20th century. He captures it very well. Now, what do you do if you're attacked by evil spirits, or if you have an ill fate that seems somehow decreed by heaven? What can you do about it? One might turn to a famous rabbi, of course, but the rabbinate as such did not recognize that as part of its role. A wide discrepancy existed between the needs of ordinary Jews and the willingness or ability of rabbinic leadership to fulfill those needs. The highly intellectualized learning world in Eastern Europe, with its great emphasis on the legal tradition, did little to support people's need for a holy man. The typical Rav, the typical rabbi, was not taught to give out blessings that might protect or help Jews in need in facing personal troubles. Perhaps sensing this gap, some well-known rabbis indeed became Kabbalists or even Baalei Shem. A Baal Shem, ordained or not, stood in the breach, having the professional role of healer, which might also mean intercessor. The Baal Shem could provide you with an amulet or teach you a formula of holy names to recite, or give you an herbal potion to drink, all of which might ward off the evil spirits that were beleaguering you. Of course, an effective Baal Shem knew about herbs and knew about natural medicines as well as holy names. You might say it was the herbs that worked, you might say it was the names that worked, that's up to you. But the combination somehow seemed to lead to enough success that Baalei Shem were widely believed in areas where modern medicine had not yet begun to penetrate. There were Baalei Shem prior to the Besht who were also shamans in the fullest sense. That is to say, partaking of out-of-the-body experiences, rising up to the heavens, having revelations, and so on. But this was not essential to the fulfillment of their professional role. You did not have to have those experiences to be a practicing Baal Shem. Some of the more famous Baalei Shem were able to make claim to special righteousness or venerated ancestry, but not all of them. This too was not a requirement. Baalei Shem were plying a holy trade. They were comparable to the role, you might say, of mohel, which is a ritual circumciser, or shechet, a ritual slaughterer. They were in charge of the medical area. They were healers. That was their role in the community. Subject, of course, to the generally expected norms of piety, they were men possessed of esoteric knowledge, especially that of divine names and their supernatural powers. A Baal Shem is, in short, a magician, one particularly devoted to the art of healing, or a folk doctor possessed of esoteric knowledge. Like shamans and magicians everywhere, Baalei Shem, especially the less rabbinically learned among them, were seen to be figures somewhat marginal to ordinary society. The very nature of their work depended upon some knowledge of and contact with the dark side, the realm of demons who so filled the imagination of Jews in that era. Exorcisms of evil spirits were among their most famous deeds. They most likely had contact with some non-Jewish sources and people on the other side of the societal line. Both on the folk and established medical levels, they would exchange potions, they would exchange herbs, knowledge about plants growing in the area with Polish babas, older Polish women who also were maintainers of these secrets in Polish society. And we have a wonderful document that my friend Yochanan Petrovsky discovered in the library in Kiev, the diary of a man named Hillel Baal Shem, and he had bits of pharmaceutical knowledge. He quotes things in Polish, he quotes bits and pieces of formulae in Latin from doctors, which he barely understood, but somehow copied into his Hebrew script, and they too become part of his Baal Shem's package of cures. But these were people who were not seen as quite legitimate in the world of rabbinic authority, that's for sure. This point is especially evident in the most revealing account of the initial reception of the Baal Shem Tov to the community of Mejbush, where he came and tried to be accepted in proto-Hasidic circles. And Shivchei HaBesh, the legendary biography of the Baal Shem Tov, tells the following story. When the Besht arrived in the community of Mejbush, he was not considered important, that is to say, legitimate, in the eyes of the Hasidim, namely people like Reb Zev Kitzis and Reb David Furkas, who later became his main disciples. This was because of the title Baal Shem, by which he was called. Such a name is not appropriate for a tzaddik. There was something, Baal Shem is respectable people, stay away from such characters. Here we see a clear sense of distinction, even opposition, between these two spiritual appellations. A Baal Shem, almost by definition, cannot be a tzaddik. But what about the tzaddikim as intercessors in the pre-Hasidic world? Weren't they doing that too? Well, they were known that tzaddikim were known to be beloved by God and capable of effective prayer because God loves the prayers of the righteous. There were generally not well-known and identified tzaddikim who were going around giving blessings to intercede for you. That tzaddikim of the past were much revered, and intercession at their graves was a highly important devotional activity. To go to Kivrei tzaddikim, to go to the graves of the righteous, was considered a meritorious thing and a helpful thing if you were in trouble. Especially after the Safed revival, when there were stories about Rabbi Moshe Cordovero and so on going and stretching himself out on the graves of the various ancient sages in the Holy Land. That became a large part of praxis in Central and Eastern Europe. But the living righteous, like the famous 36 hidden tzaddikim, in pre-Hasidic times were not supposed to reveal themselves. It was considered immodest, it was considered contrary to your identity as a tzaddik to reveal yourself, because you were supposed to be a secret doer of good, secretly upholding God's world. They were to keep hidden and were not regularly in the habit of giving out blessings. Early Hasidism is a particular historical matrix in which a transition takes place. The role of Baal Shem coming to be subsumed under that of tzaddik. Hasidic teaching in that first generation makes a great point of coaxing tzaddikim out of the closet, suggesting there's something selfish or insecure about a tzaddik who hides himself for others, as though he just has enough energy to do his own holy life but doesn't have enough power to give to anybody else, thereby denying others any benefit from his special status in the eyes of God. Long-standing traditions of modesty and reticence needed to be pushed aside to make this happen. The Maggid famously interpreted the Talmudic passage to the effect that the Talmud says one of the miracles of the ancient temple in Jerusalem was Basar Kodesh lo hisriach me'olam. Holy flesh never rotted. That means to say that when they brought animals into the temple courtyard and they prepared the sacrifices, and there was sun was shining down in Jerusalem as it can in the summer, they never had a problem with the flesh going bad before it was sacrificed. Well, the Maggid says, Basar Kodesh lo hisriach me'olam means if you are truly holy flesh, being in contact with ordinary people won't make you stink. That's how he reads it. Basar Kodesh lo hisriach, holy flesh doesn't turn bad from contact with the olam. Olam in Yiddish means with the public. So Being in touch with people won't make you stink. Therefore, it's all right for you as a tzaddik to reveal yourself and you don't have to keep yourself hidden. You don't have to fear being polluted. Once Hasidism proclaimed that they were indeed living tzaddikim who can be found, revered, and followed, the function served by the Baal Shem very quickly migrated to those tzaddikim. Tellingly, there is no other Baal Shem prominently associated with the Hasidic movement after the Baal Shem Tov. Baalei Shem simply disappear. There's no longer need for one. The Hasidic tzaddik has taken his place. Surely he can pray for your sick child, your barren wife, or your failing business. He's also the one who can ward off the broader evils that affect the Jewish community as a whole. That tzaddik might still use some of the old magical devices, which did not disappear with the advent of Hasidism. Eastern European Jewish life, especially in the Ukrainian, Moldavian regions, was immersed in magical beliefs and practices right down to the modern times. Many of them practiced alongside and intertwined with faith in the tzaddik. Hasidism, I want to suggest, may be interpreted as an attempt to normalize the powers that had previously belonged to the Baal Shem, to bring them into the domain and restrictions of normative society. Perhaps the Shifrei HaBesht account of the Besht's early adventures, his move from near hermit status in the Carpathian Mountains to at first difficult acceptance in the circles of urban and educated Kabbalists, and ultimately to stand at the center of his own house of study in Mejbish. Perhaps that whole story may be seen as a dramatic portrayal of the move of these esoteric teachings from the periphery into the center of Jewish life, in the regions where Hasidism was to flourish. But in Hasidism, a very important difference is seen over against this background. In the new Hasidic hierarchy of values, personal piety and intensity of prayer take precedence over a body of esoteric knowledge about holy names and how to write or pronounce them. It's more important how pious you are and how much of a lover of God you are than how many secret names you have imbibed and what secrets you know about how to make the amulet. The tzaddik absorbs the Baal Shem rather than vice versa. It is God's love for the tzaddik and his exceptional devotion that causes him to be endowed with extraordinary powers. Even though some tzaddikim continue to use holy names and amulets, these devices themselves were increasingly seen as powered by the piety of the one who prescribed or wrote them, rather than being independently potent. Even today, there was a wonderful exhibit on Hasidism at the Hebrew University at the Israel Museum a couple of years ago, and I had the privilege of writing the guide to that to Hasidism for that. And they had cups that were made from shmiras. There were silver cups that were made from leftover gifts of coins that had been given by tzaddikim to various people. You would then take the coins that tzaddik gave you and melt them into a silver cup and use that cup for kiddush, use that cup for ritual drinking. But it was which Rebbe it came from, was the fact that it came from the Rizhner, it came from the Sadager or the Boyaner that made it holy. It wasn't because of the names on the coins, it was because of who had handled them. A special place in this transition may belong to the story of the Baal Shem Tov's use of amulets containing only his own name. In a tale told connected with the Besht's relationship to Rabbi Yitzchak of Drobich, the father of Rabbi Michal of Zlotchev, part of the narrative of his slow acceptance, we hear that Rabbi Yitzchak, dismayed by the effectiveness of the Baal Shem's amulets, felt there must be something wrong. This guy is too good. His amulets are too helpful. Too many people are getting cured. He says there must be some improper use of holy names. He must be calling on the wrong side. He must have demonic names in there because he's being more effective than anybody we know. And he therefore renders them ineffective by his own counter magic. When the Besht complains to Rabbi Yitzchak, he reveals that only his own name, Yisrael ben Sarah, Israel the son of Sarah, is inside the amulets. And when they open them up, they see there's nothing there but his own name. While this tale may be variously interpreted, does it mean it's the person? Does it mean he's a greater magician, that he's so powerful that his name alone does it? I take it to indicate that as recognition by its authors, by those who transmitted the tale, that the power in an amulet derives from the righteousness of the one writing it, rather than from the intrinsic power of the names that it contained. The subordination of Baal Shem to powers, the Baal Shem-like powers to the spiritual counseling of the Hasidic master is also attested by this wonderful self-describing parable told by Rabbi Nahum of Chernobyl, one of the founders of Hasidism in Ukraine. Chernobyl was a great center of Hasidic pilgrimage. It was known for another kind of light before it was known for the kind of light you associate with it. And he says the following about himself. This was recorded in a book written before 1825, Siftei Tzadikim, that are very, very authentic early sources. Listen to him describe himself. Am I not a sort of peddler bearing a peddler's potions? I have needles, pins, and knitting needles. I have all kinds of herbs. Whoever needs herbs can find them with me. If you require a needle, I have one to stick you. I can also heal the sick and make the barren fruitful. I can restore souls and stir up wars. I can uproot kingdoms and make for plenty in the world. I can end wars and renew pleasure in your love life. I can make plants grow. I can bring about various sorts of blessing and nullify old decrees. I can implant wisdom and preach like a mighty wellspring. To sum it up, everything is in the Tzaddik's hands, following the secret of the Tzaddik rules by the fear of God. And now listen to him carefully. I both make up these examples and fulfill them. Some people would be embarrassed or ashamed to come to me to receive penance for their sins. For that reason, I attribute to myself all these other things, like the healing of the sick and making the barren fruitful and all the rest. Then, when someone sees a person coming to see me, he might say, oh, he must have some need regarding sickness or childbearing. In this way, people won't be ashamed. Whoever has sin or transgression on his hands will come to me, and with God's help, I will heal his spirit. It's a very revealing self-description. Here the tzaddik seems to be offering a confession that his various wares, including the ability to heal, are tucked into his peddler's pack as something of a ruse. The real reason why people need to come to him is for spiritual counsel. It's only to protect their privacy in doing so, and generally to make himself more accessible, that he holds on to all the rest. Can he really do all those things? Does he pretend to do all those things? Are they a cover for his real work, which is spiritual counsel, repentance? What has happened here, I would argue, is a transformation of the nature of magic that characterizes Hasidism's position as a phenomenon of the early modern world. As modernity emerges, people begin to lose their faith in the hocus pocus of magical names. Enchantment is departing from the esoteric realm of divine names and magic formulae, coming to rest instead in personal charisma. The supernatural is still real and needed. The Hasidic master is a figure who retains the mysterious aura of a soul who visits the upper worlds, who brings blessing forth to share it with mortals. Those are still needed and real. But increasingly he does so by virtue of the God-given charms of his own personality and the relationship he cultivates with those around him. At the risk of being accused of Buberianism, I would want to make the claim that the efficacy of the tzaddik's power to affect the divine will now has everything to do with relationship. I refer to two relationships, that between the tzaddik and God, and that between him and his Hasidim. The Blessed Holy One desires the prayers of the righteous. That's a very old rubric going back to the Talmud. God has an affectionate relationship with the tzaddik, who is his son in a particularly intimate way, just as was true of the ancient Chanina Medosa, who was called in the Talmud, Chanina Bani, Chanina my son. It is because of that relationship that his prayer is likely to be heard, and thus his blessing sought. In this sense, Hasidism is reviving an ancient trope rather than creating a new one. But the other relationship, that between the tzaddik and his Hasidim, is no less important here. The word Hasid, which is a very ancient word in Hebrew, goes back to biblical, you find it in the Psalms already, for the first time in its long history, now takes on a new meaning, disciple. If you say you're a Chassid, you say in Yiddish, Zevem and Fultir, to whom do you travel? Whose Chassid are you? You're not just a Chassid, you're somebody's Chassid. You're a Belzer Chassid, you're a Vizhnitzer Chassid, you are a Chassid of a certain Rebbe. The word Chassid has come to mean disciple. That's new in Hasidism. The question, to whom do you travel, would make no sense in the earlier usage of the term. A Baal Shem could perform his magic for any client who approached him, and presumably paid the appropriate fee. One might say, of course, the efficacy of cures had a great deal to do with the client's belief in his powers, but that's not a stated part of the contract. He's a magician. He does his magic. The fact that you believe in it is your business. The Rebbe seeks something more. He wants devotion from his disciples. He expects them to stand in the same relationship of love and awe toward him that he does in relationship with God. His claim as Rebbe is that he is an neshama klalit, an oversoul, and that those who are attracted to becoming his disciples are attracted to him because they belong to his soul root, his shoresh neshama. It's because of the congruence of these two relationships that he's able to serve as the channel of blessing to flow into them. The Chassid must have his heart open to God and the tzaddik, his earthly representative, in order to receive and pass on that blessing. Nothing expresses this more clearly than a very interesting change in the understanding of the financial relationship that takes place between the tzaddik and the chassid who comes to him with a request for prayer. The gift he gives, the gift the disciple gives to the master when he comes and says, pray for me, include me in your prayers, you come to the master, you give him a kvittel. A kvittel is a little petition, a piece of paper, and on it will say your name, it will label Ben Sarah, it will say your name and your matronym, your mother's name, because mother's names were more intimate than father's names. For healing, you use mother's names. For honors in the synagogue, it was father's names, but for healing, a mother's name was seen as more effective. So it would say label Ben Sarah, and you would say, Tsar Gidel Bonim, I'm having trouble raising my children. Or it might say, Lifkot Akara, to help a barren woman, who childbirth was often a very big issue, or for healer, for healing, something like that. You brought that kvittel to the Rebbe, and with that kvittel you gave something called a pidyon. A pidyon literally means a redemption, but it was a gift of money. You gave it to the Rebbe along with your kvittel. Usually you came to the Rebbe's shamus first. You came to his assistant outside. The shamus would help you write the kvittel. And you would come with the kvittel and the pidyon, and you would hand them to the Rebbe. The gift he gives, accompanying his kvittel or written petition, is called a pidyon nefesh, a redemption of soul. The term is found in pre-Hasidic sources, and may ultimately be derived from the ritual of pidyon haben, where the life of a firstborn son is redeemed from divine service for a gift of money. The ceremony for pidyon nefesh is found at the end of Nathan Hanover's prayer compendium Shaarei Tzion, first published in Prague in 1662, which is to say 100 years before Hasidism. There, a specific number of coins involved in the ceremony must be given to charity. The remainder enters the realm of the profane, it says there, becomes chulin, and are given to the Kabbalist, or the Baal Shem, who performs the rite. That's his fee. Here he's acting as a paid professional. There's the pidyon, which goes to charity, and then the leftover is his fee, which he collects. His fee is a profane matter. But as Hasidism adapts this model, its nature is changed. The entire pidyon goes to the tzaddik. It is considered kodesh, not chol. It's holy, not profane. He is no longer an agent taking a fee. The whole point of the pidyon nefesh is now to create an attachment, even a sense of mutual obligation between master and disciple, so that the former owes it to the petitioner to redeem his soul from its lowly state, because he's paid for it. Taking it along with him as his own divinely sought prayer ascends before the heavenly throne of glory. This transaction is an entirely relational one, bringing the heart's desire of the ordinary Jew into the divine realm, carried on the wings of those two sacred relationships between God and the tzaddik and his disciple. None of this is diminished by the fact that some of these tzaddikim still might use means inherited from the Baal Shem in order to help with the healing or good fortune of those who sought them out. Changes in religious outlook happen slowly, after all. There's no denunciation of the old magic that accompanies this shift of attitudes within Hasidism. The Hasidic masters were much too preoccupied with their campaign against routine religious behavior and the conflict with rabbinic authorities and then the maskilim, to take up an opposition to a practice that had always, after all, been part of the folk tradition and associated with their movement's own hero, the Baal Shem Tov. It's true the shift isn't even a universal one, and it was most characteristic in the Maggid school and may have even diminished as Hasidism became a popular movement later. Returning to the three aspects of the Besht's career, the ordinary Jew had neither the supernatural powers of the magician nor the ability to comprehend or concentrate on those Lurianic prayer directions that belong to the Kabbalistic tradition. But neither was needed by a Jew who submitted himself to a relationship with the true tzaddik, since the Rebbe himself was the personification of all those secrets. You didn't need the names, you didn't need the kavanot. You had the Rebbe. Let the Rebbe concentrate on the kavanot. You've attached yourself to the Rebbe by your gift. That's all you need anymore. The next step one that was only taken partially and to varying degrees, was one in which this esoteric knowledge was no longer needed by the tzaddik himself. Since he's a holy man, he doesn't need to know the secret names anymore. At the same time, there was no great rush on the part of the tzaddikim who were interested in increasing their sway over the public to announce that they were bereft of this secret knowledge. If the people needed to believe that there was a magical as well as a devotional power in the hands of their leaders, why was it necessary to disabuse them? I'm suggesting here that Moshe Idel's famous mystical, magical model, where the mystical side is expressed in the tzaddik's rise to God, and the magical hermetic side of this blessing-laden return, descent into the world, he brings down the blessing, is not adequate to describe the spiritual role of the Hasidic tzaddik. The circle around Dov Berabim, which saw the assent or acceptance of their prayers brought about by their love of God and awe before his presence, regularly described as wings that allow one's prayer to soar. For the Maggid and some of his disciples, this was also an act of bitul, self-negation, required for the dveikut that was the goal of their prayers. Depending on precisely how one defines the term, one may indeed call this mystical. But the flow of divine bounty or blessing that came about in response to the tzaddik's prayer was testament to the mutuality of that love. God loved the tzaddik as much as the tzaddik loved God. God is a parent. God gives his blessing to his beloved child as a token of their love, not because the tzaddik is possessed of power, not because he knows the right formula that allows him to deliver the goods. Now here I'm skipping a series of texts which I back this up with, but the textual tradition is a little technical, and so you'll have to read that in a written version if you like. We're coming to the end. There is power in the hands of the tzaddikim, as portrayed by the Maggid and his disciples. They are indeed powerful figures. They are indeed channels of blessing, as the Besht had already taught. Blessing that may become manifest in the traditionally defined realms of Baneh Chaye Mezoneh, offspring, praying for good health, and praying for making a living, for sustenance. But this power, to adapt a term from today's political discourse, is soft power rather than hard power. It comes about because of the intensity of the parent-child love that exists, both between God and the tzaddik, and between the tzaddik and his own flock. A final comment. The parent-child metaphor for the love between God and the tzaddik and his disciples takes a central place in the imagination of early Hasidism. Compared to the Zohar, or even later Kabbalah, there is relatively little of Hiros Gamos, or bridal eros, or sexual union, in the Hasidic sources. The more passionate love interest is that between father and child. This is particularly highlighted in the Maggid himself, who had a single son after long years of barrenness, and who seems to have served as an affectionate father figure to his disciples as well. But it may also reflect the real world of 18th century Polish Jewry. Early and arranged marriages were the norm, especially in the areas and class out of which Hasidism emerged. Marriages arranged at 13, carried out at 14 or 15 sometimes, or maybe in the later years of adolescence, but not beyond that. The courtier and troubadour context that was so much a part of the world of the Zohar back in medieval Spain had been long forgotten. Here there was almost no gap between puberty and childbearing, with little chance for romance to develop. If there were such feelings, they were seen as the doing of the evil urge. In such an environment, the sublimation of love energies into devoted filial piety, directed both toward God and toward his earthly embodiment in the loving, kindly tzaddik, may indeed have become quite natural. Thank you. Hope you got a little sense of the aura, the environment of Hasidism as I tried to convey it.
Thank you so much for this. This was incredibly stimulating. I'm drawn back to one of the famous articles on the study of Hasidism, where one of the founding fathers of the scholarship on Hasidism says there's nothing original in Hasidism, absolutely nothing, except the tzaddik. And I think you've given us a different way of understanding that in the context of a movement that is original in lots of different ways. Thank you very much. I think we have a little bit of time now.
But it is the tzaddik in a certain way, but
sure.
but
the heart of this
yeah.
much deeper transformation. We have a little bit of time now for some question and answers. Art, I'll let you field your own questions. You can choose either to have one person, or if you want to collect around.
Feel free. Let's see what happens.
Yes, Bill.
Something you brought up. One of the amulets, when I first studied, I studied with Shlomo Karlbach, I studied the Baal Shem.
He didn't give out amulets, did he?
Not public. Maybe the 60s in San Francisco.
Yes.
I would say that. But what I learned is one of the Tzaddik said that he had the name of God. He put it in an amulet and gave it to the person. When the person opened the amulet, his mother's name was in there.
Well, that's more or less, that's another version of the same story I'm telling here. If there's nothing there, in other words, it's not magic, the magic is about the love. That's the idea. The magic is really about the love that Tzaddik has for his disciples. It was probably his name and his mother's name, something like that, because usually, as I say, the matronym usually accompany your own name. Yeah.
It's really interesting to reflect on this juxtaposition between the healer and the magician, and what's happening now in modern medicine, and that frontier of bioethics and sound healing and laying on of the hands, and the medical profession itself undergoing this transformation of being more than the mechanics.
Physicians being trained in relationship, yes, indeed.
Relationship and in bioethics and in the spiritual aspect of relating to the family as a family member is transiting and being sensitive to so many other levels of things, that the healer is the tzaddik, really, and that's coming to the doctors and the healers in our modern time in a sort of revival of this, which is really beautiful.
I think it's a great insight, thank you. And the two connection between two terms, cure and healing, is really, I think, at the heart of that. The physician was once there thinking it was usually he in those days, of course, had the magical power to cure. He knew the scientific secrets. But let me take this back to an older conversation that I learned first from one of my favorite teachers of a generation ago, the late Professor Yochanan Mufs, who in those days taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary. He talked about, based on the anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski, Magic, Science, and Religion. You may remember that book, some of you, it was a great classic 70 years ago. And he talked about the relationship between magic and science. He said, in the Greek world, magic evolved into science. If you knew the secrets of the universe, you would know how to handle it, how to manage it. That was an impersonal force. Magic had to do with the fates, and the fates that control things, and if you knew the secrets, then you could control them. Whereas in ancient Israel, of course, it all became personified. It was not a matter of control, it was a matter of supplication. You had to enter into relationship with God. You had to do that which made God love you, and then God would change things for you. God would help your fate. In the Greek world, the gods diminished, the gods became less important. Magic, therefore, was more important, and magic evolved into science. And so we may be seeing a kind of readjusting of the balance here, where that self-proclaimed scientism, in a certain way, that knew all, is now realizing there's something in that other world of relationship and a certain amount of humility and submission that needs to be brought in. Yeah, thank you.
That reduction of the love of God and the love of the disciples invokes the image of Christianity that reduces everything to the love of God and the love of the other. Was that one of the possible sources of recognizing in one of the previous rabbis of Chabad as a figure that resurrected? And is that too much similar to Christianity that even creates resurrected rabbis?
I don't think the statement in the New Testament that the whole teaching is about love of God and love of neighbor is anything that was very alien to the rabbinic tradition. Remember, Hillel said beforehand that what is hateful to your neighbor, don't to you, don't do to your neighbor. Rabbi Akiva, a century later, says that the whole Torah is love your neighbor as yourself. So I think that the combination of love of God and love of neighbor is something ancient in both traditions. I don't think you have to see it as Christian influence to say that that's what's going on here. But there is a kind of folk religion here that goes back to very old sources. This figure of Hanina ben Dosa, who is a healer from the 2nd century. And if you read people like Geza Vermej and Eli and Idel, they connect that figure. Jesus emerges from that nexus, from that milieu that's happening in early Judaism. And he too is a kind of folk hero, healer, no question about that. There's no question that all of those stories, both the Jesus stories and the Hanina stories, go back to the figures of Elijah and Elisha in the Book of Kings. And so you may say that this kind of folk prophet or folk healer is a very ancient figure who was revived in various contexts. Revived, I think, in the Jesus narratives of the New Testament in the 1st century, and revived again in the Hasidic narratives of the 18th century. They're all against the same background. Now, the figure of the late Lubavitcher Rebbe becoming Messiah, that's a very complicated story. That's another story. And I think there was, for that you have to understand the 20th century through the lens of a Russian Jew who has seen everything that happened in the 20th century and tried to imagine how you can possibly explain it. And ultimately there was no way to explain it except that these are messianic times. You take a pious Russian Jew like the Lubavitcher Rebbe. The Lubavitchers, the Chabad, had a tradition that they were always loyal to the Tsar. From the War of 1812 on, they were loyal to the Tsar no matter what happened. Well, then the Russian Revolution comes and suddenly the Tsar is overturned and you have this wicked kingdom of atheists who are destroying Judaism. And then, lo and behold, a more wicked kingdom appears from the West, Germany. And this battle, World War II, as far as Jew in Russia was concerned, was a battle between Germany and Russia. The Americans and British were sort of off somewhere, but it was Germany versus Russia. That was the war of Gog and Magog. That was exactly as predicted by the prophet Ezekiel, Gog and Magog. And finally, Gog conquers Magog, the Russians defeat the Germans. 3 years later, there's a Jewish state proclaimed. Go tell me this is not Messianic times. It's just very hard to, if you are a pious Russian Jew who's lived through that. A Jewish state is proclaimed, and then we conquer the old city, and then the Rebbe has no children. It almost had an inner logic, I think, to it. And that comes out of this whole tradition, but is very much related to what happened to the whole narrative of the 20th century.
Yes, I'm really interested in what feels to me like a tension in the story that you tell between the centrality of the filial love between the tzaddik and the chassid on the one hand, and the pidyon, the monetization that in some ways seals the relationship or creates the relationship perhaps, or sustains the relationship in both ways in a sense. Was there ever any critique that arose within the community about
the maskilim, the modern enlightened Jews made hay of this, of course.
So
right.
Say more about that.
The modern enlightened Jews laughed at this, and the Middle European Jews who were embarrassed by Hasidism, anything too Ostjüdisch, anything too Eastern European was embarrassing to German Jews, and so historians like Gretz pointed to this and say, of course, look what they're ripping off gullible people. Of course, this is just nonsense. This is just these are all charlatans. And he referred to them as Wunderrabbiner, kind of, wonder rabbis who were charlatans, who were stealing from the poor. But they were, in the Hasidic world, there was nothing shameful about that. It had to be a mutual relationship. In other words, for the Rebbe to owe you the obligation of praying for you, you had to give him something. You didn't have a spiritual thing to give him. You only had your kopecks to give him. So you would give a gift to the Rebbe, small or large, depending on what you could afford. And that would seal the blessing. May I tell you a little story? Interrupt and tell you a little story. Here we are. This tradition has gone on now for a couple of hundred years. Here we are in Philadelphia, 1970s. In a neighborhood not too far from where I lived in Philadelphia, but not the same neighborhood, very much a changing neighborhood where the Jews were almost all gone, and it was becoming an African-American neighborhood, and the elderly Jews left were scared. I walk into a Hasidic shtibel. There's still a Rabbi left at East Mount Airy, for those of you who know Philadelphia. And a friend and I would walk over to where his service were, because he couldn't get a minyan. He couldn't get 10 Jews together for a quorum for prayer. So we would walk in. And I open a book one day, a prayer book, and a little piece of paper falls out, and I pick it up. It's a kvittel for a Rebbe. And it says like this, La Isha Masha Bas Basha, whatever her name was, for the woman Masha, the daughter of Basha. May she have power over her neighbors, and may she find a proper dwelling among the Jews. This is an old woman who's scared in a changing neighborhood in Philadelphia, and she goes to the Rebbe for a blessing. So she goes to the Rebbe for a blessing. Now it happens that in that synagogue, as in many immigrant generation synagogues, when you went up for an honor called to the Torah, you would give a gift. And I hear somebody going up, and the Rebbe sits on the side, and he says, he whispers into the ear of the person that's giving him the blessing, that I'm giving $5 to the synagogue. And suddenly here the Rebbe belt out, "Finif toller is nicht genig." $5 is not enough. Okay, that's this tradition in its most corrupted form. Okay. Steve, please.
And I've never heard anyone connect Lubavitch messianism with a Russian background. Of course, secular messianism, both Zionist and Bundist, comes out of Russia.
Yes, different kind of messianism. Yeah.
But I don't know that I could connect those and what you're saying. But two quick questions. The evidence of Moshe Rossman and others about the eventual respectability of the Bash is living in communally supported home, etc. Could you just talk about how that meshes with what you've argued? I could see it, but if you could elaborate on that, and then your apology for seeming to draw from Buber, and because it seemed to me that there were echoes of Buber in what you were arguing at the best of Buber.
Yes.
Could you just speak just briefly about how you would actually enter Buber into the conversation, and what one might draw from him, and perhaps the way in which he was excessively disparaged?
Good. Wonderful. Two wonderful questions. Thank you. Yes. Eventually, there's no question, the Baal Shem Tov is supported by the community of Mejbech, and he gains respectability. The question is, was it always that way? Now, more challenging than Rossman's work is work by Adam Teller, whom I'm sure you know. Oh, was he? Oh, okay, so you certainly know. And so when the Baal Shem Tov is called to Slutsk, that's fairly early. And so I think there was a line in here that Irving and I were discussing earlier when I say this tale in the Shivchei about how the Baal Shem Tov is a hermit in the woods and living in the mountains, and he comes in and he's not accepted. It takes time for him to be accepted, and finally he is, and then he has his own cloys. Maybe that's really a dramatic presentation of how this kind of teaching was marginal and gained greater acceptance. Maybe that story is made up to embody this the movement of Baal Shem-like religion into the legitimate normative world of the tzaddik. And I think that's the process. Hasidism in some ways is taking these esoteric traditions and humanizing them or normalizing them, legitimating them by subsuming them to this ethos of relationship. Now, the ethos of relationship, of course, that's Buber. But Buber got it from Hasidism. Buber studied Hasidism, and much of his I and Thou came after his initial romance with Hasidism. Yes, I think Sholem dismissed Buber much too fast and much too hard. I have another paper, entirely different matter, talking about the Buber-Sholem debate with regard to the uplifting of sparks, you remember, Buber said that Hasidism is a real valuation of the concrete world, that divinity is found everywhere. And Shalom said, oh no, you're really supposed to lift the sparks out of the world, and then the world disappears. The world becomes, well, I think it depends which Hasidic text you're reading and which page you're reading it on. I've spent the last several years with my favorite of these people, the Me'orei Naim, the peddler guy, who wrote a book called The Light of the Eyes, and that's my translation of it hopefully will come out one of these days soon, if Yale Judaica series ever gets around to waking up. And there I'm convinced he's a Buberian. He is a Hasidic Rebbe who really fits the Buber model much more. He loves Gashmius. He loves the physical world, and you can really see a sense that there's a celebration of the divinity right there in the physical world. He's not removing it. You go to the Maggid, his teacher, and I think it's the other way. It really depends whom you're reading. So I think Buber has been pushed aside too much, and Idel agrees. Idel also is quoting more Buber than you would expect would be the case in decades following Sholem. I think Buber and Hillel Zeitlin are both being brought back as people who were utterly dismissed by Sholem as romantics and so on. And Idel and others are re-examining them, looking again, and finding more insight there than Sholem would have given them credit for. Yeah. Can we call on someone else who hasn't had a chance yet? Yes, please, ma'am. No, on the aisle, yes.
So I'm interested in this concept of an intercessor that you spoke about, and thinking about the extent to which I have found some remnants of that in our contemporary Jewish life. Not so much amongst the liberal/reform/reconstructionists, but amongst my more observant and orthodox friends and community. The idea that there are people who are on a higher spiritual level or closer to God in some way. And so I'm asking myself, and I'd really like to ask you, is our struggle with the idea of an intercessor one that we want everyone to be equal in their access or sense of God, or is it a struggle about prayer at all, that we should have our prayers heard and answered by God? Or is it something to do with a spiritual hierarchy that in some aspects of Jewish life today we're uncomfortable with in some communities, while others are still more comfortable with that idea?
Can I check all of the above? And is it or? It's all of the above. Listen, Judaism as we were taught it in the modern West is a very, may I say, parave kind of Judaism. How do you say that in English? A very sort of milquetoasty kind of Judaism. We were told that Judaism is democratic, is egalitarian, everybody has access to God because God loves everybody, and therefore it doesn't make any difference. But in folk Judaism, as it was practiced in Eastern Europe, down to modern times, as it was practiced in North Africa, as it was practiced in Iran, there were definitely holy people whom you went to for blessings, and they had some power. The graves of the tzaddikim, the graves of the righteous, were visited as much in Morocco as they were in the Ukraine. And there are now pilgrimages of Jews who go from Israel to Morocco on the anniversaries of the death of various people in Morocco to visit their graves. The recovery of holy graves in the land of Israel, which to us Westerners looks a little silly and looks almost trivial. I remember going to see the grave of Joseph when it was discovered in somewhere near the city of Shechem, the city of Nablus. And there's a stone that says Joseph, and on either end, one stone says Ephraim and one stone says Manasseh. Like there he is, buried with the two sons on either side. It's kind of cute for us, but there are people who take it very seriously. And there are busloads of Jews who go those places, and people pour out their heart. I remember visiting the grave of Samuel the prophet, which is undoubtedly the tomb of some sheikh, of 16th or 18th century sheikh. But it was proclaimed the tomb of Samuel the prophet, and there There are dozens of women wailing and crying because that's a place you can go for help in childbirth. And these are people who needed help, and they went to that grave. And for us Western Jews to say, oh, that's pagan and that's not Judaism and so on, we can't quite do it because it doesn't fit our westernized, very westernized notions of what Judaism is. So there are, in the history of Judaism, there have been intercessors. And they are usually people who are blessed either because of special righteousness, maybe because of holy ancestry. They come from great families, and ancestry yichus was something that was very much prized among Jews. So if you're a Rebbe who's a descendant of a Rebbe, descendant of the Baal Shem Tov or something like that, that gives you some special status in the world. You can't ask me if these things are effective. That's a matter of your belief, but that has been a part of folk Judaism for a very long time and has not completely gone away. Now, I've been involved in training rabbis for many years. Rabbi Karatzinski is a member of actually our first class of rabbis I trained at Hebrew College in Boston. Wonderful to see you. And rabbis, rabbinical students often ask me, what do I do? Chaplaincy. What do I do when I walk into a sick room and somebody says, Rabbi, pray for me, and they think I have some special powers because I'm a rabbi? What am I supposed to do? And I said, that's not the moment to disabuse them. What they need from you is support. They don't need to hear your theological doubts or your question, wait a minute, Judaism is egalitarian. You can pray for yourself. That's not what people need at that point. So people for good reason respond to what people need, and so we do pray for people, but more than that I can't say. I can say it's an ancient part of the tradition, and it is still alive, and people still need it.
You mentioned right now it was a good prelude of I guess tzaddikim, or I'm not sure the exact term we would use, of holy, by and large men, but not entirely, Jews in Iran or Morocco or non-Ashkenazi centric places. I'm wondering if you have a certain, in terms of the phenomenology of this shift from the Baal Shem to a tzaddik, in terms of what these terms mean and such, I'm wondering if you had similar shifts in non-Ashkenazi.
Great question, and I don't really know enough. The term Baal Shem is a term used in Ashkenaz. I haven't seen the term Baal Shem used in North Africa or used elsewhere, but amulets are very real. Still, among Persian Jews, especially very strong amulet making tradition. And I would say in the Near Eastern communities in general, not so much Yemenites, but Persians, Iraqis, Moroccans, I would say, have a strong dose of that kind of piety. A figure like the Baba Salih, the Abu Khatsera dynasty, who now live in southern Israel, but were great names already in Morocco. Those are people who certainly affect healings, and people go to them for blessings. And so in that sense, they are very much popular holy men. How much, you see, I don't know enough, how much it is relationship with the Baba Salih you need in order to get a blessing, I don't think so. I think its power of ancestry is very strong there. And the fact that he comes from that family and his descendants come from that family, you can get a blessing from one of his children, because you see it now even among the children of somebody like Ovadia Yosef, who was a kind of more modern rabbi and even a sort of Ashkenazed rabbi in the Sephardic tradition. His children are now giving out blessings, I hear. So some of it, a lot of it there, I think has to do with ancestry. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
Since
great to see you all.
We talked about Buber. I feel like we should also invoke the name of Abraham Joshua Heschel. In one of his famous essays on Jewish education, he says that what we need in our generation are not more textbooks, but text people. It's true in the 20th century, it's true in the 19th century, it was true in the 18th century. Thank you very much for helping us to understand the emergence of that question. Thank you.